Okay, Nick. Well, let me also begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me and for convening this very interesting conference. I will talk about the subject which we already said, physicians at war, on the question of whether physicians at war are betraying a pacifist medical ethos. This is the sub-questions I put on the title, kind of try to spell out what I mean by that. Do physicians have an obligation to be or act as pacifists? What limits are set by medical ethics to physicians' participation in war? Or, as you could try to summarize this, is there what I call a medical pacifism that all physicians should respect? Well, to briefly explain you how I came to work on these topics, I'm now working since 2 years in Zurich, 2 years and a bit more at the Ethics Center, on a research position called Military Medical Ethics. So this is the academic association. Then there's also an institutional cooperation with the International Committee for Military Medicine, which is a non-state organization that puts together the medical service of 104, I think, states, in order to have a better care for the wounded on the battlefield at the beginning. Now we have this Reference Center of Education of International Humanitarian Law and Ethics, where we are giving some courses in the law of armed conflict, where we try to establish a session, a series of military medical ethics courses and workshops, and where we will establish some kind of advisory board in the future, but that's something that will depend on the finances. Speaking of financing, I'm financed by the Federal Department of Defense, Civil Protection and Sport, the Swiss Federal Department. Still, everything that I'm going to say is personal and not connected with any of these institutions. So, kind of my job today, or the aim of my talk, is kind of to question my job, because if there was a pacifist commitment of the medical service, then I would not have to do any military medical ethics. So I have to be kind of cautious, but still no one's listening from those who pay. And also, I wondered kind of who is my addressee, who's the addressee of the ideas that I have. And this morning, Asa Kasher was telling that he was working for the police or for the military. So perhaps that's also what I'm looking for, as an applicable argument, or as he formulated, a conception that can be understood. My talk will consist of 3 main parts. After an introduction, I will try to establish what I call a professional pacifism or medical pacifism. Have some look into the theory. What does it mean? Why could medicine be a pacifist profession? And try to establish some contingent or vocational medical pacifism. And then have a look at the reality. What are physicians' involvement in war actually? Before to draw some conclusions. So my talk is perhaps more in the domain of applied philosophy or applied pacifism, I don't know, or applicable pacifism, and not so much on the foundations and theoretical distinctions and things like that. Well, the issue, I have 3 quotes that try to illustrate, 3 very short quotes that try to illustrate the problem of physicians' involvement in war. The first, from an author called List: preventing health crisis, war being an example, is a professional and moral duty for physicians. Now, I mean, preventing health crisis, surely that's a moral duty and professional obligations of physicians. Still, whether war is an example of a health crisis, we could wonder. Sure, it gives rise to a number of health crises, so the connection is quite clear. The second one, from the World Health Assembly, which is a part of the World Health Organization: the role of physicians and other health workers in the preservation and promotion of peace is the most significant factor for the attainment of health for all. So once again, you don't have a commitment not to take part in war, but a commitment to promote peace in order to attain health for everyone. And the last one: if war is unavoidable, then it should be waged with as little barbarity as possible. This one is from Henri Dunant, who was the founder of the Red Cross movement, and he here summarizes the spirit of the Geneva Conventions. So we have 3 very different accounts, I would say, where the last one might perhaps be the the most interesting one, because, I think he was a lawyer, not a physician, but watching what was going on after this Battle of Solferino, he did not call for physicians not to take part in war or just to promote pacifism, but he wanted them to cooperate better and to treat the wounded and to treat all of them equally. And all these things I'm coming back to later, which are in the Geneva Conventions. Now, some more historical aspects of the cooperation of physicians and doctors in war. Sure, everything starts with Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath, but it seems that Hippocrates was not so keen on treating everyone equally, but more on treating the Greek population. Kind of the same thing in just war theory, where you could, in the Greek tradition, I think you can wage war against every barbarian, because, they're barbarians, they're not human, so they have kind of this idea of just war, but only within the Greek community. You'll find some medical mercenaries in the Middle Ages, but an organized military and medical service only very late in the 18th century. Then, as I was already quoted, the Battle of Solferino and the movement of Henri Dunant in Europe, and perhaps also you could quote the Lieber Code in the US, where you have this Red Cross movement emerging with the idea of impartial healers, the medics as impartial healers. And then later on, mostly in the 20th century, we have the idea of the medical service as the possibility for pacifists to serve in the armed forces. Well, the idea that you can serve in the armed forces, that you do not have to conscientiously object, can you say that? But that you can just go into the medical service. And sure, you have institutions like the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, or Physicians for Socially Responsible, PSR probably, which are rather committed to pacifism, a kind of contingent pacifism, because they say the consequences of nuclear war would be so terrible that it's just to be prevented at all. Well, another reason for the relevance of the issue is that we still have the participation in nowadays war of doctors in kind of immoral research and inhumane treatment of detainees, so not perhaps, hopefully not in immoral research. And the Nuremberg Code that had been established after the Second World War in a reaction to these crimes. We still have the participation of doctors in torture or harsh interrogation, like in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. And we have, I've had reported that personally the participation of doctors as fighting soldiers in recent conflicts. They didn't wear the Red Cross emblem anymore, they just put it away, but they were fighting, and that kind of just questions the separation of the roles and puts the question how doctors should react to the threat of war and which rules they should follow during war. And the research questions that I put to myself then is there something like a professional pacifism? An obligation to pacifism which results from the adherence to or the practice of a profession. That's why I call it professional pacifism. And more concretely to my question, are physicians as practitioners of the medical profession obliged to pacifism or to some kind of pacifism? So what I want to do is to try to establish a link between professional obligations and a pacifist commitment, and to try to show resulting obligations and their limits to it. When we talk of pacifist professions or a professional pacifism, the question basically is whether there are professions whose ethos requires the members to defend a pacifist position. Now, medicine is probably one of the professions that comes very, very fast to mind, and I will go on to this later, but you could also think of different professions like, I don't know, perhaps judges who are committed to solving conflicts, well, on a non-violent level at least. And perhaps, and that's a more provocative question, also soldiers, I don't know, if they're not committed to a clearly non-violent position, but rather to a kind of teleological pacifism, which would abolish war in the end, but allow for some wars to be fought. And they might even be, well, not a pacifist profession, but at least a profession that's in a way concerned with pacifism. Now, pacifism and professional ethos, what's the connection? Well, the question, as I already quoted, is, are there professions whose ethos requires their members to defend and live a pacifist profession, or in a more restricted version, that require a pacifist exercise of their professional duties. This is an important distinction, I think, because you don't have to be then a pacifist in all situations, but only during the execution of your exercise of your profession. How can this connection between ethos and pacifism be established? And isn't pacifism rather a personal political choice that is independent from the profession? And what kind of professional obligation could in the end imply a pacifist obligation? Now, I'll go over this very quickly because we've talked a lot about this. I think there are different aspects of pacifism. You can have a rather absolutist pacifism, which has a position that can be summarized as non-violence. This is a commitment against all forms of violence. You have an anti-warist pacifism, which is a commitment against all forms of war, and you have what is called pacifism, as I found it in literature, which is a teleological commitment to abolish war in the long run, but which would allow for some wars in last resort in our days, which are imperfect. I think what I will be concerned with mostly is anti-warism and pacifism, as a total commitment to non-violence would just go too far. The shared assumption of all these is that war is generally bad and should be avoided, and one should not take part in war, or at least not in aggressive war. There are some varieties of pacifism. We've heard this distinction between absolute and contingent pacifism, which draws on the extent of the obligation, on whether it's about all wars or particular wars, and also, and that's the more interesting point for me here, there can be some contingent pacifism which obliges only one group of persons, and not everyone. You can have maximal or minimal pacifism. It might be kind of the same as the extent of the commitment of non-violence, and you can also have universal or particular pacifism, which addresses the question who has finally the obligation to be a pacifist. And this is also something that is important in the context of professional pacifism. Yes. Now, as I want to connect pacifism and professional ethos, let me just say some words on what I mean by professional ethos. Basically, I see it as a set of professional beliefs, practices, and conduct that are binding and obligatory for the members of the profession, be it by law or an association's regulation, by an oath as for emetics, maybe also customary habitude or just a tradition. So it's not very fixed very often, but you might find, and in the case of medical ethics, medical profession, it's quite clear that you might find something that forms the core of a profession's or of the profession's code of conduct. Professional pacifism then, and that's, well, first try to give somewhat a definition, would have to be conceptualized as a form of particular and contingent pacifism, insofar as it addresses only the members of one profession. It would therefore not address the general questions of a possible justification of war, but only the question whether the members of the profession could take part in war, or rather would have a dispensation to do so, or even an obligation to oppose war. And a professional pacifism would be implied by a professional ethos, by the rules of a profession, that is inconsistent with the participation in war or warlike activities. To summarize, and it kind of gives the same points, it's a contingent, or as sometimes they call it, vocational pacifism, which is particular as it addresses only the members of one profession. It could be minimal or maximal regarding its positioning towards war, and it therefore may require either total opposition to war and violence, or just restrict the professional practice during war. And this last point is perhaps the one which is, again, the most interesting and important one when the participation of physicians in war is concerned. Now, medicine as a pacifist profession, or a medical pacifism, as I already said a bit, is, in my opinion, the medical profession with its fundamental principle, first do no harm, could very likely be a profession that demands a pacifist positioning. And therefore the main question of my paper is whether physicians have a special obligation to promote peace and prevent war. Now, if we look at the medical ethos, which would be the reason for this commitment, we have some of these, I just put the most important rules that I found together. Where you have the Hippocratic Oath, which has been restated in the Geneva Declaration in 1949, I think. Where you have this principle of salus aegroti suprema lex, so first care for your patient, then first do no harm, primum non nocere, with the obligation to care and cure the sick and wounded and prevent harm for occurring, which is normally in the principlism is stated as the principle of beneficence. Still, there are some questions or some questions and some more points. The first principle, I will exercise my art solely for the cure of my patients and the prevention of disease. This says just nothing on what the physician does in his free time or when he's not acting as a physician. Then, first, do no harm. This, in my opinion, only applies to doctor-patient relationship, so it doesn't tell anything on do not harm to, I don't know, to anyone else, which could be a principle based on different moral obligations, but which does not follow from medical ethics. And then prevent harm from occurring. Clearly, the question is what kind of harm, and is it also harm to society? Because if you say that war in some form is harm to society, then this could also be an argument for not going to war. For a physician, still not reacting to some aggression from outside, from different other countries, could also pose harm to a society. If you look at the general medical ethics and war, then the questions are, what do these obligations tell us regarding an obligatory positioning towards war for physicians? Well, war certainly entails harm to people, and prevention of harm is an important medical obligation, so this prima facie is a good argument to rather promote peace than war. However, and I already had this point a bit, do professional medical obligations go beyond the doctor-patient relationship? And this is, I think, an interesting question. What kind of obligations towards the society or even towards mankind do arise out of the medical ethos? Is there anything? And do these obligations go beyond the practice of medicine? So, does it only apply to physicians when they are acting as physicians? If you have a look at, until now I looked at the medical ethos as far as times of peace are concerned. If you now look at the regulations for the medical professions that bound them during war, we have two main documents perhaps, which is one, the more important one, the Geneva Declarations, which is below, and the other one, the Declaration of the World Medical Association on, it's the World Medical Association Regulations for Times of Armed Conflict or so, which states that medical ethics in times of armed conflict is identical to medical ethics in times of peace, and standard ethical norms apply. So this would just tell us that a doctor is a doctor, and whether there's peace or war does not make any difference. And then an interesting point in a later paragraph says that where conflict appears to be imminent and inevitable, physicians should ensure that authorities are planning for the repair of the public health infrastructure in the immediate post-conflict period. Now this is interesting because this clearly gives an obligation to care for the medical infrastructure and the medical services, but it gives in no way any obligation to try to prevent this conflict from happening. And in the Geneva Conventions you will find the protection of the medical service and personnel, and a strict obligation to neutrality of the medical service, which means you have to treat all equally, be they friend or foe, be they from yours or your enemy troops. Still, neither the Declaration of the World Medical Association nor the Geneva Conventions do oblige physicians to resist the participation in war or to work for the prevention of war. And both seem to acknowledge the importance of the medical service and its neutrality during war. This kind of seems to me as a pragmatic solution for the best care of the sick and wounded, with a minimal aim of upholding medical ethics, and to work merely in the interest of the patient, even during war. And both emphasize what has been described as the separation of the healing role from the wounding role. It's the separation of the medical service from the combatants and combat troops. To summarize, what kind of professional obligations of medical ethics are there for physicians with regard to war? Well, the question was, do basic medical ethics imply an obligation to prevent war? My point was that the obligation to do no harm concerns mostly or even merely the doctor-patient relationship. But there is, on the other hand, an obligation not to use medical knowledge for aims other than for the sake of the patient. And the specific medical codes for times of armed conflict do only imply an obligation to neutrality of the medical services and to always respect medical ethics. So there would be no obligation to prevent war following these documents that could be taken as the basic of a medical ethos, and there would be no obligation not to serve in national armed forces or in armed forces in general. So, to summarize, for the question, is there a medical pacifism? I think we could say that there is. Medicine would not be a pacifist profession in the full sense. That would imply a commitment to absolute non-violence. However, the medical ethos would not allow for, or does not allow for, an unconcerned position with regard to the exercise of the profession during war. That should be fine. And the obligation to medical neutrality can be seen as some sort of a pacifist or at least anti-warist commitment, insofar as the medical ethos always remains patient-oriented and the exercise of the profession untouched by war. So, with this in mind, let's try to have a look at what I called, this was so far, so you could call a theory, and I wanted now to have a short look into practice, into physicians' involvement in war. Going from the assumption that if there is no medical pacifist obligation for physicians, or at least no practical way to avoid any involvement in war, what kind of participation of physicians in war could be ethically defendable? I have basically 3 points or 3 issues I want to address here. First, the problem of mixed roles. Second, the more general problem of medical tasks during war. And third and lastly, the problem of medicine being at risk of becoming a weapon in a war. Now, the first problem of mixed roles, are physicians combatants or non-combatants? In the Geneva Conventions, which are the law, there's a strict separation of medical and military roles. That has been questioned in recent years whether this separation really can always be upheld. One of the responses is to send medics or paramedics that just are part of the well, they're not really physicians, they are just paramedics, and they are fighting with the normal troops. They don't wear any distinctive sign. So this is just a reaction because you feel that you cannot uphold this distinction in practice. Where this quote shows that this traditional distinction between wounding and combat role, between wounding role and healing role, have become increasingly more ambitious. And note this is a quote from 1974, so it's not really a new problem. It's even older than me. And the last part of this, or another problem, or part of this problem, is the question of the armament of medical units and of the bearing of the distinctive emblem. This is something that in Afghanistan has been very much the case, I think. I know this from German armed forces. They just don't wear any distinctive emblem. They just cover the Red Cross and put a machine gun on the ambulance, which isn't an ambulance anymore. So from the legal point of view, it's not a problem, because you just have a car, you have the medical personnel sitting in it, but none of it wearing any distinctive signs, so they are allowed for putting a machine gun on top of it. But still, there is a big danger of losing the purely medical role with the associated special protection and neutrality. And this is one of the points that I'm kind of concerned with, that you should distinguish between those roles, even if the enemy doesn't do it. Still, I see the problem. You do not want to have a cross on it if the enemy thinks, well, this is a good occasion to take as a target because it marks exactly where you have to target on. So it's a practical problem. The second problem is perhaps more general. It's the problematic mission of physician soldiers, which in the US Armed Forces is described as conservation of the fighting strength. Now this clearly gives a different priorities different from those of civilian doctors, either in the order of treatment or in the allocation of resources. Because if you have to conserve the fighting strength of your army, then you don't treat an enemy, clearly. Which would be against the Geneva Conventions, and which also would kind of go against every medical ethos. This also is described by Michael Gross as that military medical ethics introduces the imperative of military necessity along the four other principles of normal or ordinary medical ethics. And here again, I think the problem is you can introduce a fifth principle. I wouldn't be against that, but the way he does it is it's kind of an overriding principle. So basically he says there's military necessity, and if there's no necessity, well, then you can work as a doctor. But when there's military necessity, well, you have to work as a soldier. And so basically it's military ethics that just win over any medical ethics. And this problem has been very good formulated by Nemeth in a recent article, where he says that the military medical personnel faces the conflict originated both from the medical and military professions. And ethical issues arise when the physician is forced to choose between the benefit of an individual patient and the needs of an army. So that kind of tells us what the problem of this double role as physician and soldier is. And last problem in practice that I want to concentrate today is that medicine sometimes itself might be at the risk of becoming a weapon. Either in trying to win the hearts and minds of the populations, then you will see that medical aid is very, very close, or even even it is a means of psychological warfare. Then you might have the problem of assistance in the intelligence gathering. For example, to find Osama bin Laden, they launched a huge campaign to vaccinate, and at the same time collect the DNA data. So that clearly is a mixture of roles, and which wouldn't be allowed by any medical ethics, which has patient confidentiality. And last but not least, the assistance in interrogation and torture, where the use of medical knowledge clearly is contrary to any medical ethics. And one remark on waterboarding, someone, you were mentioning it today, there's high medical, how do you say that? Not knowledge, but you can prove that very small amounts of waterboarding have high impact on the functioning of the neural system. Yeah. So, conclusion, are physicians at war betraying a pacifist ethos, or are they just helping those that are in need? I think they have a very difficult task to respect a partially pacifist ethos during wartime, with the obligations of neutrality and the patient-centered obligations only. They should perhaps not be pacifists, but try to have a concerned exercise of their professions, a profession which would mean to respect medical ethics, to try to not to become a weapon, and also perhaps sometimes to be kind of a watchdog for human rights abuses, because very often physicians are the first ones that see that. Because if someone's tortured, very often afterwards you have a doctor to care for him so that he does not die. Because if you torture someone, you want to have some information, and so you want him alive. And there would be, I think, at least a moral obligation to report if there isn't even a legal obligation to report. Well, prevent war and reduce its consequences. I think it's kind of perhaps a supererogatory obligation of physicians to take part in organizations like the Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War or Physicians for Social Responsibility. Whereas there is, I think, a big question whether physicians should participate in weapon development, be it non-lethal weapons that could reduce the harm, or be it lethal weapons, or be it something even different. It's a question that I could have put under 4 in the practical problems, and I just put it now here. Well, to put it very briefly, ethical conflicts occur whenever medicine and war intersect. The Geneva Convention once again says that under no circumstances shall any person be punished for carrying out medical activities compatible with medical ethics, regardless of the person benefiting therefrom, which would mean that you can care for any enemy without that you should be punished by your own armed forces. This is the theory. I don't think that this would always be respected in practice. And so the best solution would be to be a physician first, last, and always, because then you would not have to deal with any obligations from the military, but still, if you're working within the military, this is kind of a difficult task that, yeah, I don't know whether one can fulfill it, but this is perhaps what physicians should try to aim for. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. This is a really interesting project. I think you don't want to draw as stark a distinction as you have between physicians and other kinds of medical personnel. I was a medical corpsman.
Other medical personnel, yeah.
Yeah, I was a medical corpsman attached to a Marine Corps combat unit. And we were taught the same, even though we didn't take the Hippocratic Oath, we were taught the same expectations of neutrality and treatment and stuff like that. So I think that you can group medical personnel together and not just physicians. I think the same thing would stand. Now, you mentioned the issue of people covering their insignia and stuff like that. We were also taught to do that because there was a study from Vietnam between 1967 and 1969 that said the average life expectancy of a Navy corpsman attached to a Marine Corps unit was 41 days because the Vietnamese knew that if they shot either the officer or the medical corpsman, that the unit became non-operational. So, I mean, there's those reasons, and I think those are separate things to look at as opposed to what the obligations are of the personnel in terms of treating and whatnot. But I think there's good reasons for why people do that other than they want to switch roles. Right?
Yeah, sure. There's some practical reasons. I'm totally aware of that.
Yeah.
On your first point, you wanted to say that I should uphold this distinction or just not?
No, I think you made it too stronger. I think the distinction between physicians who have the Hippocratic Oath and all this kind of stuff and other medical personnel. Yeah. And I don't think you want to make that distinction.
In fact, I don't want to make it. It's something that you very often hear, that you can have this distinction and that you can have paramedics that don't have the obligation of a physician. I don't think this is the case. Right. And basically this starts because any physician that gives away his knowledge, that teaches someone, has to be sure that this someone will use this knowledge in accordance with the Hippocratic Oath again. So basically, if you take the Hippocratic Oath serious, then you cannot teach someone medical knowledge knowing that he will apply it in a different way.
It's not just about the knowledge either, though. I mean, in my experience, physicians, I don't want to be too stark about this, but physicians are almost never the ones that you need to worry about, right? Because most of them are in, hospitals that are sort of behind the lines. The ones you really need to worry about are the corpsmen and the paramedics and stuff that are embedded with the units. Yeah, physicians are generally not.
Yeah.
Yeah. You put the questions pertaining to the general topic in such a way as to subtly apply a kind of cosmopolitanism inherent in the medical profession, and perhaps the Hippocratic Oath is a part of that. But on the face of it, however, the medical person has the knowledge and skills which can be used in all kinds of different ways, right? And for example, you can sell them to the highest bidder and make as much money as possible with them. In the case of war, certainly he could take it that his task was to maximize the war effort of his army by, fixing up people who were on our side. A sort of macabre spin-off might be to try to, poison or something the enemy. But stopping short of that, it's not obvious that a medical person couldn't inherently be selective in the direction of favoring his own side's war effort, right? And then one could further argue that insofar as he's a part of the army, that would be his obligation.
Well,
I mean, there's nothing inherently necessarily pacifistic, so to say, or cosmopolitan, as I like to put it, about even though many of them are, and you can understand that, but it's not obviously necessary, and it would need some argument.
I'm not sure. I think in a certain way there is some obligation to be neutral and not to be favoring one's own side from the beginning.
Where would that come from?
I think it's just a medical obligation, and you find that in the Geneva Conventions where it's clearly written that you have to treat all equally, and you only make any distinction based on medical grounds, not on race or whatever. This is kind of the same thing that you're not allowed to be racist in your own country.
But you're not explaining what the motivation for that convention is. It's not just pulled out of the thin air. The motivation for that convention is the same motivation as we have for the treatment of prisoners of war and so on and so forth. It has to do with whether or not I can allow myself to lie in the field, right, on the enemy side of the line. In other words, if I'm shot and so on, right, whether or not I can be allowed to stay there. And there has to be this confidence that if I am abandoned to the enemy position, that I will be treated in the same way that the enemy. It's a reciprocal arrangement. Now, if it turns out, right, that the other side is not honoring, right, the Red Cross, the symbols, right, for the people who are supposed to be immune, then of course all bets are off, and that's exactly what happens, it's not as if these constraints arise out of the medical profession. These are constraints that arise out of the exigencies of war.
I think it arises of both of the professions, perhaps, and clearly there's some point in reciprocity, and that's the basic for why we have these conventions.
Right.
But still, if one of the sides does not respect it, are you then allowed not to respect it either? I don't think. If the other side is becoming terrorists, you should still not use terrorist methods. And if the other side is violating the principle of discrimination or non-discrimination.
But then the question becomes, where are you pulling your obligation out of, right?
Yeah, then it's kind of a moral obligation not to. Yeah, sure. It's a different one, and I think it's in practice it's a big problem, sure. But in theory, I think you should not just base this on the idea of reciprocity. There's also the idea of humanity behind it, and you should just not forget about all these conventions only because your enemy is not respecting it. I think that would go just too far. Perhaps it has also to do with something with self-respect, or I don't know. If your enemy is shooting his POWs, will you shoot your own? I don't know.